and provide for our needs without violating the laws of nature. We can look at this without performing what we would deem a miracle. If you want to call him doing that a miracle, that's fine, but for purposes of what we're talking about, a miracle is God violating the laws of nature to bring about an end. We spoke about free will. We have free will to choose or accept God's will. We spoke about God's intentional will. That's what he would like for all of us. We spoke about God's circumstantial will, which is his will for us in spite of our stupidity, and how he's going to work around it. And then we spoke about God's ultimate will, which cannot be thwarted regardless of our free will. So we looked at how God provides for us in those ways. We looked at God's promise of good, how all things will work together for good for them that love the Lord, who are the called according to his purpose. Our definition of good and God's can a lot of times differ, but God knows what's best and God wants what is best. We spoke about God's promise of prayer, of his presence in our lives, of the ability to overcome temptation. We considered God's providential role in government. And then last week, we looked at the subject, God will provide, and how he provided for Abraham in a specific instance. This morning, we're going to look at the two best-known cases of providence. That's Joseph and Esther. So, let's start with Joseph. This is kind of the part where I get into the storytelling and makes it a little easier sometimes. I think we're all very familiar with him, but just a quick recap. Joseph was the son of Jacob. He was the favorite son of Jacob out of 12 sons. Why was he the favorite son?
The youngest.
Almost.
No, because his mother was his favorite.
His mother was his favorite. So, Mike, going back to the circumstances of this, remember, Jacob saw Rachel, and he went and bargained for her hand in marriage and said, yes, I'll work 7 years for her hand in marriage. Jacob said, okay. Laban, Rachel's dad, said, okay. Entered that agreement. Then he pulled the old switcheroo on the wedding night and put Leah in the place instead. The next morning, Jacob comes out and says, you tricked me. And he said, well, it's a shame for the younger daughter to go before the older. Just work another 7 years for me. You like how he's getting all this free labor out of the deal? And so he did. He also, by the way, wound up marrying their handmaidens just so they could give more children to him, thinking that would bring favor. But Rachel was the wife that he wanted, the one that he chose out of it. The others, honestly, were kind of thrust upon him. So Joseph, being the firstborn child of Rachel, is his favorite. That's his pride and joy. Not that he didn't love the others or take pride and joy in them, but that was what we might refer to as the golden child. Y'all have heard that expression? The gray heads are shaking yes. Everybody else is like, huh?
That's what our other kids call Scott.
That's what everybody calls Scott in your family? I'm going to have to joke with him about that now. To top it all off, Joseph kind of becomes a snitch. He brings a negative report to their dad about what the other brothers are doing. There's a saying, it comes from a streaming TV show that was on Netflix called Boss Baby. Snitches get stitches. Is that how it was with your siblings? Yeah, pretty much everybody's saying yes. Okay. And that's kind of their outlook in this situation. To top it off, then Joseph has not one but two dreams about his brothers and his parents bowing down before him. And he's sharing this with them. Now, here is the golden child with all these dreams. And he's like, oh, y'all are going to bow down before me. They're thinking it's just because daddy's favoritism, and he picks up on it too. And anyway, this does not sit well with them. So in the end, he goes to check on his brothers, And of course, they're thinking, oh, here comes that snitch again. They take Joseph. They were going to kill him, but Reuben, the oldest, the firstborn, with the protective instincts that firstborns have y'all noticed that in families, by the way? Firstborn usually has the protective instincts over the younger ones. I hear a giggle, maybe not so for one or two families. You know, look, my brother would pick on me, but if anybody else ever did, they were in for trouble. He sees what's going on, and he decides he can't stop them from what they want to do, so he devises this plan. He says, let's throw him in a pit and leave him there. That way his blood won't be on our hands. And he had secretly planned to come back and save Joseph later on. But while this is going on and Joseph is in the pit, some Egyptian slave traders come by. And Judah, anybody know a famous descendant of Judah? David? Jesus? Okay. Judah says, you know, there ain't no money in it for us if we do this. What value is it to us other than just get rid of them? Why don't we sell them to the Egyptians? And that way we can at least make some money on it. So that's what they do. Reuben has gone away. He comes back, and it's too late for him to hatch his plan to save Joseph. Joseph goes into the house of a man by the name of Potiphar. Potiphar sees Joseph's value and makes him his chief steward. The problem is Mrs. Potiphar takes a shining to Joseph. She likes him, and she says, I want you to come lay with me. He says, no, that's not right. My master loves me. He trusts me. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against? Who did he say he was going to sin against if he did it? God. She did not accept that answer. She kept on, and then finally, her longing grew such that she went to lay hands on him. She grabbed him, was going to take him by force. Joseph slipped out of his coat, turned tail, and ran away. Sometimes faced with temptation, that's the only thing you can do. The other alternatives are gone because you fought it, and the only thing you can do is just flee the scene. In her anger and bitterness about being spurned, she goes to her husband and says, he came on to me, I grabbed his jacket when he ran away, when I yelled out, and he realized he was caught, so he ran. What are you going to do? Now, is a slave owner entitled to kill his slave during this time period? Yes. Potiphar doesn't do that. I suspect he probably trusted Joseph maybe more than he trusted his wife in this regard, but he's also got the entire situation to be considerate of. I suspect, it's my think so, and you can disagree with my think so, and we're still brethren, and that's fine. I think that he knew she was lying, but had to do something, so he showed the most leniency to Joseph he could by having him thrown into prison. Then, while in prison, Joseph interprets dreams for two people, Pharaoh's butler and, was it the baker? Yeah, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. No, the butler and the baker. All right. And as he does so, one dies, one returns to Pharaoh's right hand and says, I will remember you when I stand before Pharaoh. Guess what he forgot to do? To mention Joseph and bring it back up, right? So, all this goes on until the point that Pharaoh has a very troubling dream. And no one could interpret the dream in all the land of Egypt. And finally, the butler says, I remember my sin now. I forgot all about that poor guy who told me I was going to get out. I was so happy for my freedom, I just forgot about the whole thing. Pharaoh, I know somebody who can interpret your dream, and I know right where to find him. Now, I'm talking primarily about the non-miraculous aspects of this, right? There were some miracles involved in this, right? Yes? He dreamed about his brothers bowing before him. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams correctly, Pharaoh's butler's dream correctly, and Pharaoh's butler forgot about Joseph until the right time, which means he was right where he left him. He would then go on to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, which allowed him to become the number 2 man basically in all the world, because Egypt was in the most powerful nation in the world. But really, when you look at this, most of this was almost what we might call coincidental, right? Just things happened and happened and happened, and everybody just happened to be in the right place. Let's read in Genesis 41. And Tate, if you don't mind, if you'll read Genesis 41, 25 through 33. All right. So Joseph, through his God-given special talent, miraculous ability, correctly interprets the dream. And then he adds this piece of advice. If I was you, Pharaoh, I'd set up somebody who's going to overlook all the collection of grain and to supervise it to make sure we got what we need to get through. Pharaoh says, is there anyone better qualified than you? I'm nominating you for this. I'm going to read a quote here because a lot of my notes come from a book by Dr. Cecil May, and this is the quote I have from him. The chain of interesting providential circumstances is still not complete. Joseph would not have been in Egypt had his brothers not sold him into slavery. That was brought about by the favoritism shown to Joseph by his father, which was aggravated, no doubt, by Joseph's recounting of his dreams that implied his superiority. And the brothers' plan would not have worked out had the traders been just a few minutes later in passing, for Reuben had planned to come by and free Joseph. A whole set of remarkable circumstances, some would say coincidences, some good, some related to the integrity of Joseph, some related to the evil of others, all worked together to put Joseph in a position to save his family from famine. So here is Joseph, and lo and behold, what's going to happen as a result of all this? Because he's the only one with food, his brothers wind up coming before him. They don't know who he is. They think he's long since dead, so they don't recognize him. Joseph overhears his brothers talking. He overhears that Reuben planned to come back and save him, and Joseph has compassion. He reveals himself to him, sends for them to bring back the family so that he could take care of them. And then we have this thought in Genesis 50. If we can go ahead and turn there. Genesis chapter 50. And Mr. Charles, do you mind reading 15 through 21?
Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. They said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. So they sent messengers to Joseph, saying, Before your father died, he commanded, saying, Thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. How far?
21.
And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we are your servants. Joseph said to them, Do not be afraid, for I am in the place of God. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them.
All right, so Joseph says, am I in the place of God that I should bring judgment? That's its own lesson that we could probably stand to hear on our own, right? The gist of this is, you meant it for evil. God used it to bring about good and to save a great many lives. God providentially handled this situation, putting Joseph where he could be useful and where Judah, who would ultimately produce David and Jesus, among many, many others, could be spared. God has providentially protected the seed line of Christ. Now, what about Esther, the other example of providence? Esther is kind of an interesting book of the Bible because it is the only book of the Bible where God is not named. No miracle is recorded, but we can see God's hand at work. The king Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, is in control. Anyone, by the way, know what he's famous for outside of this setting of the Bible? Because of the movie, I think it's probably like a younger person question, but
Defeating the Greeks.
defeating the Greeks. The Spartan 300, right? The movie, which I never watched just because all I saw in the preview was blood flying everywhere, and I'm like, well, I don't know that I really want to watch that. He was the one who fought against the Spartan 300. When we look at this, the first chain in the link of God's providence is going to be when Ahasuerus is drunk at a party. And he commands his wife, Vashti, I couldn't remember her name off the top of my head. He says, honey, you're gorgeous, strip and show everyone your glory. She, in her modesty and common sense, says no. But there is a problem. He has issued this command in the presence of others. The rulers back then were deemed to be gods in the minds of the people, and what they say goes, and if not followed, there's dire consequences. He then banished her, chose a new queen, which wound up being Esther. Esther is a Jew. There is also an advisor he has by the name of Haman. Haman did not like the Jews, particularly one Jew named Mordecai, because Mordecai refused to bow to Haman. So we hatched this plot. Let's go to Esther chapter 3. In Esther 3, verses 8 and 9, the Bible reads, Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from other people's, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasury. So he says, one, king, there's a rebellious group of people. They're mixed all throughout the land. They're not just in one little area. They're all over. So they're going to spread their corrupt influence to your whole kingdom. We just need to go on and wipe them out. You give me permission, I'll write up the decree, you sign it, and I'll pay for it out of my own pocket to protect you, king. So the king, in his naivety, just goes ahead without listening to anything else and signs this decree, right? Then the date has been set for when the Jews will be wiped out. However, Haman continued to be infuriated by Mordecai. So he built some gallows and he planned to go have Mordecai hanged in the morning. However, unbeknownst to Mordecai, the king can't sleep. So he calls for the Chronicles of the King to be read. And an incident is read to which he had completely forgotten about. There was a plot on his life, and a Jew by the name of Mordecai saved his life. So he calls in to Haman and asks, what should be done for the man who earns the king's delight? Now let's flip over and read Esther 6 and 7 through 10. Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, a horse on which the king has ridden, and a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to take honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits in the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. I find this evidence of God's great sense of humor and irony, don't you? The king clearly loves Mordecai, however, a decree's been issued and it cannot be revoked. Mordecai, understanding this, is going to go to Esther. So if I could get someone, Mike, do you mind reading Esther 4, 13 and 14? Four, 13 and 14.
Me, right?
Well, either or.
Either one.
All right, it's three. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?
That's one of the most, that's part of one of the most well-known passages in all the world, right? I mean, we got judge not that you be not judged, and, John 3:16, but this ranks right on up there for such a time as this. Who knew whether or not you were brought to this position for such a time as this to deliver your people? And Mordecai is pretty confident that the Jews are going to survive, right? You can shake your head yes. He says, if you fail to act, somehow we will be delivered another way, but you ain't going to escape. I think God put you here for this purpose and this reason and for this time. That brings us to Esther chapter 7. And Josh, do you mind reading Esther chapter 7 for us?
Chapter 7.
Yes, sir.
So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. On the second day of the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition? Queen Esther, it shall be granted you. And what is your request up to half the kingdom that shall be done? Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people and my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King
Ahasuerus
Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Esther said, the adversary and enemy is the wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now,
Harbonah.
Arbanon, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. So he hanged Haman on the gallows, and he prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided.
All right. So we see this justice come about for Haman being brought down upon him. We see the king actually acknowledge something he evidently had no idea about, that his wife was a Jew. And in the end, we're going to see the entire next chapter, the king is going to issue a decree that says, all right, I can't revoke the first one, but here's what we're going to do. Haman was going to pay y'all 10,000 talents of silver or whatever to do this. Well, he's dead. He ain't going to do that no more. And I'm also going to put an added thing in here. I demand that the Jews defend themselves if anybody comes. Naturally, nobody came to attack them, and the Jews were spared during this time period. All because the king couldn't sleep, read about a forgotten incident, returned the favor for the man who saved his life, and because of the brave actions of a young woman. Who knows when you and I might be called upon to act on behalf of the church and what the end result could be. We often don't really think of ourselves as living in what we might refer to as like biblical times or as part of an event being recorded, but isn't that exactly what God's word says? Every word, every deed will be brought into judgment. I think sometimes we forget that God is still active and still around us just because we don't see the miracles like we used to. So, as we look at these two instances, the two most well-known examples of providence, what are some thoughts that you have as you study these things? I know it can't be the first time that we've gone over this.
Well, number one is God's in control.
God is in control. In our world today, do we have to remind ourselves of that? We wouldn't necessarily think it looking around us, would we? I mean, 5 minutes of watching the news, would you come away going, God's in control, if that was all you knew?
There's always a lot of free will, and there's always been evil in the world, and always will be.
And there's always consequences for it. God is in control. Did you ever wonder when you read this? Because there are people who were divinators back during this time period, people who actually could interpret dreams, not just Joseph. There were people who had some abilities that we might deem miraculous. Did you ever wonder how it is that there couldn't be found a single solitary man in all Egypt that could even put forward a reasonable explanation for the king's dreams?
Because he wanted. That's not what he wanted.
That's not what God wanted. It's everybody, nobody could be found that could interpret it. When we think about Joseph, partly because it was God's plan, but also because of the fact that Joseph was a godly man, he wound up in prison. We often look at that and go, he's doing the right thing over and over again. Why is God allowing all this to happen to him? If he wasn't a godly man, would he have wound up in prison? it might have been mighty easy for him just to say, "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Potiphar, your husband's nowhere near. Let's go do this thing and be done." Do you think he would have wound up in prison then and be able to accomplish God's will? Because he would have found out eventually, right? The truth usually outs itself. You ever stop to think if Reuben had just been 10 minutes earlier or so, maybe he could have, a few hours earlier, he could have saved Joseph? What would have happened then?
When he ended up in Egypt, ended next to the king.
We look at some things, and a lot of this could be considered what we might say it's a coincidence, right? Just looking at it, you think there'd be some people who look at it and go, it's a good thing all these coincidences happen? But God's hand was involved. Joseph made the statement, I now see God's hand in this. You meant it for evil. He meant to use it as an opportunity to bring about good. What about Esther? Anybody know the name of the Jewish feast that is still celebrated today, by the way, to celebrate the deliverance of the Jews? I somehow knew that she would know that answer, Susan. When we read Esther 4:14 and Mordecai says, if you fail to act, deliverance for the Jews will come from elsewhere, but you won't escape. What could give Mordecai this confidence to say this? When y'all have studied this before, have you ever doubted the truth of that statement from Mordecai?
He knew the promises that God had made to Abraham down through Jacob and all the other line of descent of Jesus.
Okay. He knew what God had promised. He knew God would have to find a way to bring about this promise. And he placed his faith in God, which enabled him to endure the things that came his way. Does the fact that God could have chosen to deliver the Jews by a hand other than Esther's, does that in any way negate what she did? Makes you kind of wonder sometimes, if she didn't do it, how God would have brought about the deliverance, right? Are there any lessons we can take from this? And I hesitate to use this term because of the way it's used in society and in culture and in books today, but what about sacrificing things for the greater good? And when I say the greater good, I mean God's good, not what we might deem good. Yes, ma'am.
All right. For both of them, for both Mordecai and Joseph, their strong faith helped them keep their eye on the prize. The big picture. Joseph easily could have had revenge on a lot of people. When Pharaoh called him up to interpret his dreams, he could have went off the rails with something. That means you gotta give all your fatted cows to me, and then throw away the ones that are skinny. You know, he could have, he was trusting Joseph. Joseph could have ran with that if he had an evil heart. But he knew through everything that there was a greater good, there was a bigger picture. And Mordecai the same way. Esther, if you don't do this, you need to do this for your safety, but if you don't, we're still gonna be okay. So their faith guided them through all these, it made these big molehills seem like little lumps, it seems like, through their story. As they were focused straight ahead.
And building upon what you just said specifically about Joseph and how Joseph could have enacted revenge. Anybody here ever done a study on Islam?
A little bit.
a little bit. When Muhammad started coming to power and he started gaining influence, do you know who the first people he attacked was? The tribe that banished him, that he was raised in. And everything he did came with a vision or a message from Allah, right? Allah says, we got to go wipe these people out. He could have Joseph could have very easily done something similar, but he chose not to. He chose to trust in God to bring about his end. Other thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, ma'am.
So God had a hand in all of this, and this is like life or death, or prison or what. Do you think that God still has a hand in like our day-to-day things, or do you think it's still just life and death kind of?
I wouldn't even go as far as to say that it's life and death. When you talk about these instances, we're talking about God's ultimate will. Remember, we spoke about God's intentional will, what he'd like, God's circumstantial will, what he wants us to do because of our own stupidity, and finally, God's ultimate will, which shall not be thwarted no matter what. God had made a promise that no matter what, he was going to ultimately bring about Jesus through the seed of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, and so forth. Is God involved in our world today? Absolutely. Is he involved to the extent of he determines whether or not you get stuck at a red light? I'm not going there. A lot of things are left to our free will and to whether or not we will comply with what God's will for our lives is. And in order for us to know what God's will for our lives is, we got to study God's word and follow after, and in the end, trust God to sort everything out. That's hard when you get the power like Joseph did, where you literally could be judge, jury, and executioner against the brothers who threw you in a pit and sold you into slavery. I also don't read anything in the Bible about Joseph going back after Potiphar's wife. His outlook was, am I in the place of God? Jason?
Well, in talking about God's ultimate will, I mean, initially, God's will was to work through the nation of Israel. And they did the things to the point where they can no longer be part of that. They separated themselves from God, but God's will continued. Jesus came, spoke to the Jews and the Gentiles. God's will continued on, even after his chosen people made their bad choices. God's will continued. So we see all throughout the Bible God's will marching on, even though the people that are supposed to be part of that are left behind by their own actions, by their own choices.
Tate?
And one thing, look, you asked that question about suffering for the greater good. And like you said, I mean, the Jews were suffering. They were, in captivity. And the greater good came about because of Esther and providential, all that. Like you said, God's never mentioned. Same thing with Joseph. He mentions it there at the end that God meant this for good. And it reminds me of, like, of course, that verse we allude to in Romans, that all things work for good to those who love the Lord. And it does.
And I probably shouldn't use that expression. That's taken out of context too much. When I say the greater good, I should say the greatest good, which is God's good, or for God's will. There have been people who have used that exact expression in history to bring about evil. I just say it to quickly relay a point, and kind of one of those things you realize afterwards, maybe that's not the best phrasing, but it gets the point across quickly. All right, I appreciate everybody's attention and comments.
I